Welcome back to Newt's World. I'm Newt Gingrich. In episode 1 of How to Win 2026, we outlined a strategy based on history going back to Thomas Jefferson and the election of 1796. In episode 2, we discussed how decisively the Democrats have moved to become a big government socialist party with weird ideas. We gave you specific quotes from candidates and incumbents showing just how committed they are to replacing entrepreneurial free enterprise with big government socialism and to a set of radical values overwhelmingly opposed by the American people. Now in episode 3, I'm going to focus on the two hardest challenges for Republicans in this campaign, the economy and the war with Iran. We have to start by understanding that both are currently a major threat to Republican victory in 2026. If people are hurt enough economically and they feel threatened in their pocketbooks and their lifestyle, they may decide to cast a protest vote even as for a Democrat they would normally never accept. The Republican collapses in 1958, 1974, 1982, and 2018 were all performance repudiations. The party in power got blamed for what voters were feeling in their own lives. Whatever the underlying cause, voters are customers. In America, customers don't tolerate frustration and failure without changing brands or at a minimum abstaining from buying things that aren't satisfying them. On the Democratic side, the most famous modern collapse was in 2010, when Republican leader Boehner ran a brilliant, disciplined campaign with a simple, tightly focused theme. Where are the jobs? The country combined hostility to the left-wing nature of the Obama administration and the Pelosi speakership with frustration at how slowly the economy was recovering. The Contract with America campaign in 1994 had made history by picking up 54 seats. In 2010, Boehner's focused Where Are the Jobs campaign led to a historic gain of 63 House seats, the largest loss by a White House party since 1938. If Republicans drift into September and October with no clear answers on affordability, the economy, and Iran, they will run an enormous risk of being repudiated on performance by a margin so large that the advantages of money and issues may simply be drowned in a tidal wave of anger over the big issues that dominate people's lives, money and the danger of war. This episode is going to outline a demanding but doable response to both challenges. I start with a deep belief that leaders in a free society have to respect the voters and communicate with them as citizens. On the really big issues that affect people's lives, they pay attention, they talk with each other, and they render judgments that are much more sound than the elites, college professors, and news media commentators who despise the voters and treat them with contempt. There are a set of principles that apply to dealing with big issues that intrude into people's lives, get their attention, and encourage them to think about reality, because it's too important to tolerate dishonest fantasies that simply won't work. The first principle is Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's injunction that first you win the argument, then you win the vote. We have to think through what the arguments actually are in the current economic and military situations, and then set out to win them. We also have to recognize that if you're conservative, your argument is always uphill against both the propaganda media and the Democrats. Michael Barone observed years ago that in virtually every industrial democracy, the left is much better off until just before an election, because the absence of an active campaign allows the propaganda media to consistently suppress stories that would help conservatives while highlighting stories that help the left. In Barone's model, once conservatives begin campaigning and their facts and figures start competing with and exposing the falsehoods of the left, that advantage melts away. Look at the Nixon-McGovern landslide, the Reagan-Mondale landslide, the 19-point George H.W. Bush comeback against Dukakis between May and November of 1988, and the emergence of candidate Donald Trump, arguing a whole new range of facts, insights, and analyses that drove the establishment crazy, the origins of what became known as Trump derangement syndrome. All of these are examples of the power of new information, new facts, new arguments to simply win over the American people, despite every effort of the left-wing propaganda media to block conservatives and prop up the left. These campaigns are superb examples of Joseph Napolitan's principle that you should, quote, never underestimate the intelligence of the voters, nor overestimate the amount of knowledge at their disposal. Napolitan based his campaigns on giving voters the facts, arguments, and information they needed to decide his candidate was the right choice. The greatest American leaders have all understood the importance of respecting, communicating with, listening to, and educating the American people. President Lincoln captured this principle during his first debate with Stephen Douglas in Ottawa, Illinois, on August 21st, 1858. Lincoln said, quote, public sentiment is everything. With public sentiment, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. Lincoln made his belief in the public explicit again at Gettysburg when he described, quote, government of the people, by the people, for the people. The essential requirement of that people-centered model is that the people have to understand and support the policies that government is going to implement. You know, if you study Lincoln's communications throughout the Civil War, you're taking a master class in talking sense with the American people, being honest about failure and frustration, and somehow keeping the support of the vast majority of the North throughout our most painful war. And this is important as we talk about the state of the country right now and our divisions. More Americans died in the Civil War than in all our other wars combined up through Korea. And yet, Lincoln retained popular support even as loved ones, husbands and sons, kept dying in battle. President Franklin D. Roosevelt is the other great example of sustaining support through serious adult conversations that accepts frustration and limitation while convincing the vast majority of Americans to keep supporting the effort, first during the Great Depression, then through World War II. More recently, it was President Ronald Reagan's remarkable ability to communicate with the American people that turned our spirit from malaise to exceptionalism and turned our commitment to defeat the Soviet Empire into a bold, worldwide offensive that within a decade helped the entire Soviet system collapse and ended the Cold War peacefully. Candidate Donald J. Trump's invention of MAGA, Make America Great Again, and his willingness to take on issues like illegal immigration, control of the border, the counterculture's weird left-wing values, and a return to an America-centered trade and foreign policy were keys to his rise and to the growth of a nationwide movement. Now we need the same clarity and courage to deal with the two most intractable parts of our current situation: affordability and the economy on one hand, and the continuing war with the Iranian religious dictatorship on the other. Both challenges require some common principles in how we respond to them. First, we have to admit that both concerns are real. Affordability is a genuine problem for millions of Americans, and we have not yet solved it, even if we've made progress. Pretending affordability is not a problem simply makes people think you're either out of touch with reality or lying to them. Similarly, the Iran war has not gone the way we thought it would. The threat of a nuclear-armed, religiously motivated Iranian dictatorship using weapons against the United States is very real, to have a genuine conversation with the American people about where we go from here, we have to start by admitting this is a harder problem than we expected, and it's going to take a more powerful and more effective strategy to actually work. Second, we have to persuade the American people that in both cases, we're trying to solve problems we inherited, not problems we created. We have to win the argument that it was disastrous Biden policies that led to massive inflation, wide open borders, huge numbers of illegal immigrants, absurd increases in the cost of health care and insurance, and tax and regulatory policies that discouraged investment, discouraged new businesses, and discouraged private sector hiring while massively increasing government employment. We have to concede that while we're turning around the American economy and improving the tax system to favor working Americans, it's happening slower than we'd like, and there's a lot left to do. Similarly, we have to communicate that the Iranian nuclear weapons and ballistic missile program has been growing for at least 4 presidencies, and that President Trump is the first one to have the courage to actually do something serious about it. On both fronts, the honest position is the same: progress, not victory. I'll say plainly once what that means, so I don't have to keep circling back to it. We've started, we haven't finished, and pretending otherwise would cost us more credibility than admitting it ever could. After the break, the specific steps already underway to turn the economy around in enough detail that you can talk about them in your own conversations. On affordability and the economy in particular, we have to communicate the number of steps already underway, because President Trump and Republicans have been actively working to repair the damage done by President Biden and the Democrats during their 4 years in office. I want to walk through these in real detail, because the whole point of an episode like this one is giving our advocates the tools to make this same case themselves in their own words, at their own kitchen tables and town halls. We're not asking you to memorize a slogan. We're asking you to be able to explain precisely what's already changed and for whom. Healthcare is another major part of the affordability agenda, although it deserves and will get a separate episode of its own. But here's an overview. The Trump administration is enforcing stronger transparency requirements for hospitals and insurers so patients and employers can actually see what healthcare costs before they're billed for it. Republicans have also expanded eligibility and flexibility for health savings accounts. The clearest single example we have is in prescription drug prices. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reported this month that prescription drug prices have fallen every single month of 2026, down 3.9% since President Trump took office, with a 3.1% year-over-year drop in July alone. That is the steepest annual decline in prescription drug prices in more than 60 years, since 1963. That's not a Republican talking point. That's the government's own inflation data. Multiple factors are genuinely behind it. And I want to be fair about that rather than claim one cause. The administration's most favored nation pricing framework, which has brought 17 major drug companies covering the large majority of the branded market into agreements tying U.S. prices closer to what other wealthy countries pay. The new TrumpRx.gov platform, which has already generated roughly $700 million in direct patient savings and, credits where it's due, Medicare price negotiations that began under the Biden-era Inflation Reduction Act also took effect this January for 10 of the program's costliest drugs, with negotiated prices as much as 79% below list price. All of that combined is producing the steepest drop in 6 decades. Here's the number I want every one of you to have, because it's the one that genuinely lands with people. GLP-1 drugs. The diabetes and weight loss medications, they used to run more than $1,000 a month. Now start at $149 a month through TrumpRx. Insulin, inhalers, fertility drugs, and cholesterol medication have fallen between 50 and 90%. The Department of Veteran Affairs alone has locked in more than $10 billion in pharmaceutical savings this fiscal year, with hundreds of billions more projected over the long run as the most favored nation framework fully phases in. When you talk to a voter about affordability, that's the sentence to use. A drug that used to cost you $1,000 a month can now cost you $149. That's a game changer for many Americans. Now I want to discuss taxes. The Working Families Tax Cuts, also known as the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, signed into law in July of 2025, prevented a looming tax increase of roughly $1,700 per family that would have hit automatically if the 2017 tax provisions had simply been allowed to expire. The law also created no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, additional tax relief for seniors, a new deduction for interest on qualifying American-made car loans, and increased the child tax credit to $2,200 per child, indexed for inflation. In the first filing season alone, American families and workers claimed roughly $82 billion in new individual tax relief through the April 15th filing deadline. And that number is still growing as taxpayers who filed for extensions submit their returns. Nearly 8 million workers claimed the tips deduction. More than 29 million claimed the overtime deduction, with an average deduction over $3,100. More than 35 million seniors benefited from the enhanced senior deduction, with an average deduction over $7,500. And more than 1 million taxpayers used the new car loan interest deduction. The average federal refund this year came in over $3,400, about 11% higher than the year before. For millions of families, that's meaningful money to pay bills, reduce debt, make a purchase, or add to savings. The One Big Beautiful Bill also maintained the 20% small business deduction as a permanent part of the tax cut and restored immediate write-offs for research, equipment, and factory construction, which matters because businesses making those investment decisions today need to know the rules won't change again in a few years. And the Trump accounts, new tax-advantaged investment accounts for children, have already seen millions open nationwide, with a portion of eligible children already receiving the initial $1,000 pilot contribution the law provides. The Treasury's official count as of mid-April 2026 stood at 5 million accounts opened and 1.2 million children qualifying for that contribution, and both numbers have continued climbing ever since. That's a considerable investment in future generations. Congressional Republicans also made the tax system recognize skilled trades and practical training, not just four-year college degrees, by expanding the use of 529 education accounts so that vocational education and skilled trade expenses qualify for the same favorable tax treatment. A young American who wants to become an electrician, welder, or machinist gets the same tax advantage as someone pursuing a traditional four-year degree. On housing, Congress passed the 21st Century Road to Housing Act this summer. Nearly 60 provisions aimed at expanding housing supply, streamlining financing, and cutting federal red tape that adds cost and delay to home construction. I want to be straight with you about how this one actually became law. President Trump held up his signature on this bill, withholding it as leverage to pressure Congress into passing the Save America Act first, and it ultimately became law without his signature through the constitutional process that makes a bill law if the president neither signs nor vetoes it within 10 days. That's the true story about how Washington works, not just a clean, the president signed it narrative. What the law actually does still matters, regardless of how it became law. It limits large institutional investors from buying up additional single-family homes, so a young couple buying their first house isn't competing against a multi-billion-dollar investment fund for the same property, a competition they can't possibly win. On regulation, on his 11th day back in office in January 2025, President Trump signed an executive order directing federal agencies to identify regulations for repeal. Acting on that order, the Department of Energy moved to end mandates that have been driving up the cost of household appliances through ever-tightening energy standards, and the administration eased Biden-era refrigerant rules, the phase-down schedule, and leak repair requirements for hydrofluorocarbons, gave households and companies more flexibility and lower costs. Separately, the administration's Freedom to Fix initiative, formalized in a presidential memorandum signed in late June, directed the EPA to clarify that Americans have the right to repair their own vehicles, tractors, and agricultural equipment using aftermarket parts without being treated as emission law violators for doing basic maintenance. On energy, permitting reform and expanded leasing have already produced more oil and gas drilling permits than in years, with lease revenue this year already exceeding 4 full years of the prior administration combined. That doesn't show up at the pump overnight. It takes time for a faster approved lease to turn into barrels actually reaching the market. But it's the mechanism behind why gas prices, while still a genuine burden on family budgets, have come down from where they were under President Biden. House Republicans have also proposed the Power Act, not yet law, still moving through committee, which would speed the construction of pipelines, power plants, and transmission infrastructure by reforming, permitting, and strengthening the grid, while making sure the cost of powering new AI data centers doesn't get passed on to ordinary taxpayers. That last piece, sometimes called the Ratepayer Protection Pledge, is really a simple idea. If a $1 billion data center needs new power infrastructure, the data center should pay for it, not the family down the street on a fixed income. All of this offers a genuinely different approach to affordability, letting people keep more of what they earn, producing more of what families actually need, cutting unnecessary government costs, and helping families save and build assets rather than depending on a government check. I want to be honest about the other side of this too, the same way I've tried to be throughout this series. The labor market has been soft. A recent jobs report came in well below expectation, with payroll growth flat and wage growth slowing to its weakest pace in years. Inflation has come down from its peak, but it hasn't disappeared. None of the steps I just walked you through fully explain that away, and I'm not going to pretend they do. What they do show is a documented, multi-front effort already underway, not a promise, not a slogan, but concrete dollar figures, named programs, exact dates. That's the case we have to make. And it's a case that gets stronger the more precisely we make it. We also have to be honest that some of these changes are producing measurable benefits right now, while others will simply take longer. Tax relief shows up in a paycheck or a refund almost immediately. Building millions of additional homes, power plants, factories, and transmission lines takes years, not months. The argument isn't that every affordability problem has been solved. The argument is that President Trump and congressional Republicans understand the problem and are working on it systematically with a series of practical, concrete steps underway that can make Americans better off month after month and year after year. One of the keys to surviving the affordability and economy challenge is rallying everyone whose life has already been improved through these steps. The retiree who saw her Part D premium fall, the waiter or waitress who's about to file their first tip deduction return, the diabetic whose GLP-1 prescription just was reduced to 10 times cheaper than they were paying before. Talking straight about the affordability challenge and about the fact that we're working as Republicans to methodically fix it sets the stage for the next part of the conversation. Which party actually has solutions likely to work? After the break, the three arguments we have to win to make the case decisively and the Iran war challenge. That's next. We have to win three arguments about how to fix the economy. Which parties, philosophies, and policies are more likely to work for you and for the country? Which state-level policies have had people moving out and which have had people moving in? And which country do you want to live in? A free market, entrepreneurial system with customers and citizens, or a government-controlled bureaucratic system in which we become clients dependent on politicians and bureaucrats? These three arguments are a good test of Michael Barone's observation that the left has an advantage as the propaganda media can dominate with no competition in shaping what people see and learn. They're also a good test of Napolitan's principle. Never underestimate the intelligence of the American people, nor overestimate the amount of information they have. We have to win these three arguments enthusiastically and decisively enough to undo nearly 2 years of left-wing propaganda in 60 days. If we do, the entire domestic policy framework of the big government Socialist Democratic Party falls apart and is pushed towards permanent minority status for a generation or more. On the first argument, Americans overwhelmingly prefer free market enterprise to big government socialism. My own polling organization, America's New Majority Project, polled this directly last October and found 45% of voters prefer free market capitalism against just 10% who chose big government socialism, a 35-point margin. Plain socialism, without the big government framing attached, does somewhat better, but it's still far less acceptable than free enterprise. Americans in general will not vote for a big government socialist future because they don't believe the government can actually deliver. On the second argument, the evidence is overwhelming, state after state, that people are fleeing bad government with their feet. California, New York, and Illinois are consistently losing people to red states with smaller governments, lower taxes, and more take-home pay. The big government socialists want to apply to the entire country the exact policies that have been failing so decisively in those three states. They're committed to policies that would both raise taxes massively and increase the federal debt enormously, even though interest on the debt is now a bigger annual cost than the entire national defense budget. Once you move big government socialism off slogans and into specifics, its support starts to collapse. My organization's polling found 81% of Americans say they simply cannot afford higher taxes, and separately, 72% support saving an estimated $1.6 trillion over the next 10 years just by eliminating waste and fraud from government programs already on the books. That's not a country asking for more government. That's a country that thinks the government already has isn't being run honestly. On the third argument, Americans have a deep, intuitive understanding of the difference between being treated like a customer in a market and being treated like a client in a bureaucracy. Since the entire premise of big government socialism is that markets and customers are bad, but bureaucrats and clients are good, its advocates try to avoid any serious discussion of what that actually means in practice. They live in a kind of Humpty Dumpty world, like the character in Through the Looking Glass, who told Alice, quote, "When I use a word, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less," close quote. We don't have to speculate about how that plays out. We have a real ongoing example right now at a massive scale. The U.S. Postal Service lost $9 billion last year alone, and its own leadership has warned it could run out of cash by 2027. The Postal Service still handles more than 30% of all the parcel volume in this country, more than either FedEx or UPS individually. And yet, it captures only 17% of the revenue in that market, compared to UPS's 32% and FedEx's 25%, because a private competitor that has to answer to paying customers simply runs a tighter operation than an agency that doesn't. That's not a hypothetical about some future government program. That's the actual government running the actual business it already operates, decade after decade, losing money the entire time. Not many Americans believe a government bureaucracy runs things better than a well-run private business does, and it's hard to argue with them when the government's own numbers keep proving the point. If we can convince the American people that we share their concerns about affordability, that we're taking concrete steps to improve it, and that our solutions are vastly more likely to work than the left's, the current economic challenges become far less politically damaging. After the break, having won the economic argument, we still have to win the Iran argument. And I'm going to give you that one as honestly as I gave you the jobs numbers. The first step toward rebuilding the American people's support for eliminating the Iranian nuclear threat is getting back to first principles. It is a fact that the war has not gone the way we wanted. It is also a fact, and a genuinely horrifying one, that the Iranian religious dictatorship has spent much of this year massacring its own citizens. Iranian security forces began a crackdown on nationwide protests in late December of last year that has continued into this year. I want to give you the full range here rather than a single number, because even human rights investigators can't agree on one. Iran's own government puts the death toll at just over 3,000. Independent human rights monitors have verified roughly 7,000 deaths, with tens of thousands more reported, but not independently confirmed, given Iran's near-total internet blackout during the worst of the crackdown. President Trump has separately cited a figure as high as 42,000. Whatever the precise number, this is one of the worst mass killing events in the modern history of that country, carried out by a regime willing to slaughter its own people rather than tolerate dissent. And it's exactly the kind of regime we're up against. That same regime has proven tougher and more willing to endure American attacks and blockades than people expected, in the hope that the American people will simply grow tired of the fight. The Iranian strategy is very much like the North Vietnamese strategy of the late 1960s, accepting severe military defeats in the battlefield in order to convince the American news media and the American left back home that the war wasn't going well. The communists won on television what they couldn't win on the battlefield. I think we're watching a version of that same playbook in Tehran right now. There are no circumstances under which we want to put American forces on the ground in Iran, a country roughly twice the size of Texas, with a population approaching 90 million people. We may be forced instead to wage a much longer campaign of economically undermining the dictatorship while strengthening, training, and equipping the millions of Iranians who are sick of this regime and want the right to run their own country. If there's no short-term, immediate solution to the Iranian threat, then we have to focus on solutions for the world economy, so the Iranian dictatorship loses any ability to blackmail the world to control the Strait of Hormuz. We also have to supply our allies with enough defensive capability that none of them can be intimidated by Tehran. The choice of the American people has to be forced plainly. Are you willing to live in a world with a regime that chants death to America while actively trying to get the nuclear weapons and missiles to make good on it? If you want to protect American cities, then we have to come together in a patient, determined strategy that leads to a free Iran that no longer threatens its neighbors. There isn't a third path, only fantasies that have never worked. For more than 20 years, every expert has tried to find some clever way to manage an Iranian dictatorship whose religious leadership openly states its desire to annihilate the United States. Self-deception, failed bribery, and diplomacy without teeth have all failed. President Trump has had the courage to confront this threat head-on. His first efforts have not succeeded because we're facing a more ruthless and determined adversary than almost anyone expected. Our choice now is clear. Persevere, as difficult as that is, and work to save American cities, or back off and gamble that a nuclear-armed, religiously driven regime won't actually carry out what it's been chanting for years. To sum it up, if Republicans can win the arguments about affordability, the economy, and Iran, they'll be on the way to a huge victory and toward limiting the Democratic Party to a failed minority of unacceptable radicals for a generation or more. If Republicans can fight their way to even a tie on these two hardest issues, they'll almost certainly still win an historic election because of the advantages we've already built in this series. The Democrats have become the party of big government socialism with strange ideas. The natural values of the American people are now clearly center-right, with very little room left for left-wing politics outside a handful of big cities, and the emerging opportunity for longer, healthier, less expensive lives is going to let Republicans lead in a space that matters in both people's personal lives and their finances. This episode is at the center of how well Republicans can do this fall. The economy and Iran are the two hardest arguments in this whole platform, and they're also the two we cannot afford to lose. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcasts and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Join me on Substack at Gingrich360.net. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.